We are now broadcasting to everyone.
And recording.
Welcome, everyone. We're expecting close to 500 people, so just give us a few minutes as everyone comes in. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone is muted as they're coming in. So please just give us maybe 2 more minutes and we'll get started. We're waiting for close to 500 people to log on.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Aisha McDonald, and I'm the lead trainer and coordinator here at United Way of Broward County. I facilitate the community-wide trainings as well as our mental health first aid program. I am thankful you all could tune in today to our training on racial and cultural trauma. As you all enter, all participants will be muted. We do have quite a few participants registered to attend. And so if anyone wants to participate throughout the training, if you want to take part and engage with the other attendees, please feel free to use the chat box that should be at the bottom of your screen. If anyone has any direct questions or any concerns regarding any of the material that we cover, please make sure that you're entering that in the Q&A box. It should be at the bottom as well, near where the chat box is located. I do have a panel of my colleagues who will be helping to assist answer your questions as we go through today's session. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on our website. There will be certificates and CEUs made available, especially for anyone in here who is a licensed clinician and needs those CEUs. Please make sure that you're emailing me after the training so that I can follow up with you to make sure I receive your license number and can enter it into CE Broker. And if anyone needs certificates, whether to turn in to your respective organizations or just to have for yourself, please make sure that you're following up so that I can get that to you. I do ask as we go through today's training that we all assume positive intent, both on the part of myself as well as the parts of the attendees. There are some sensitive material that will be covered in today's training, as well as there may be questions that come up from the attendees as we go through the subject matter. I do ask that we assume that there is no person in this training that is asking these questions out of malicious intent, and instead that these questions are coming about because of a genuine need to learn and grow and understand better. A lot of the information that will be provided will be based on my own personal life experience, as well as research that I've reviewed throughout the years based on racial trauma. And I can only speak for myself on the part of a Black female immigrant. And so a lot of my experience will be subjective, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it speaks to everyone with my shared identity. As such, there is limitations in the information in today's session, given the fact that racial trauma really has been very focused on the Black and African American population, as well as on the Latino and Hispanic ethnicity. That is not to say that there aren't individuals from other marginalized or minority groups that experience very similar racial-based stress or racial trauma. However, it is to say that a lot of the statistics that I will be presenting is really going to be focused on those particular population because that's what the studies have been focused on. You will see similarities come up in things that other ethnic backgrounds have experienced. And I want to just be clear that I cannot speak for everybody from every ethnic background, but I do want to present the information that has been proven with scientific fact. And if you have any questions, any concerns, any further information that you would like I said, please enter it in the Q&A box where either myself or one of my panelists will respond, or you can always feel free to follow up with me directly at the email that's listed on the screen. So to get started, my colleague is going to launch a poll just so that we can get a feel of who's in the virtual room per se. And so if we can go ahead and launch that first poll and just give you a few seconds to respond, just so that we can see who's here with us today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and to share the results. We see that we have a very mixed group here with us, and hopefully it's something that everyone who's here can gain. All right. There's also going to be another poll. And this is just really to get a feel of what the professional makeup in the room is, because I know that there were some individuals who got this through their organizations or through the United Way newsletter. And so I just want to get a vibe for who's with us and what we're all about. And also to see how many CEUs I'm going to need to possibly do. If you don't identify with any of the professions listed, you can always feel free to pick community member at the bottom. We're going to go ahead and end the poll just so that we can see what the results are. Okay. So again, a mixed group of individuals. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for participating in those polls. So to get started, once we start talking about racial trauma, we have to start really with the basics. And the basics really are the layers of prejudice. I like to break down the differences between a stereotype, an implicit bias, and discrimination as the fact that a stereotype is really the thoughts and belief that we have about groups of people, maybe based on like just a generalized idea of something that we've seen members of those groups participate in or act in a certain way. And so a stereotype is the thought that we have, whereas a bias really is that prejudice and that innate feeling that we have towards those group of people based on the stereotypes that our mind has formed. And we all have biases. I have individuals who I've known throughout my life who proclaim to be open-minded, and they proclaim to be colorblind, and they proclaim to be all these things. But it's really important that we're really looking in and checking ourselves, because we all have certain biases that come up on time, whether they're negative biases or positive biases, because not every bias is necessarily always a negative stereotype about a group of people. I always like to share my personal stories throughout my trainings if anybody has ever taken a training with me. And I remember having to check myself one day, because as much as I have taught this training throughout the years, I've taught it for over 2 years now. I've been facilitating this particular course and addressing my own implicit biases in different ways. I sometimes find myself coming up with these thoughts and I have to like stop and go, wait a minute, Aisha, why? I remember there was one incident where I was at CVS and I was waiting in line, and there were 2 registers open, and there was an elderly cashier worker, and there was a very young, fresh, hip looking guy. And I remember while waiting in line, I found myself thinking, I hope the younger guy is finished with his customer first, because I don't want to get held up for too long with the older cashier. And as soon as that thought hit my head, I realized that I had formed that prejudgment about this individual purely on the basis of their age and nothing else, without knowing them, without knowing their working style, without ever having interacted with them before. And it really just made me aware of the fact that sometimes these biases come out of nowhere, and I don't necessarily have discriminatory feelings against people of an older population. But it's important that we're really paying attention to the attitudes and checking ourselves and asking why. Why did that thought come to my head? Why did I have that impression about somebody I don't know? Where is it stemming from? So discrimination, I like to say, is the actions that we do, the treatment that we perform based on the thoughts and the feelings that are within us, such as the stereotypes that we form and the implicit bias that we have unchecked. And so forms of discrimination can come out in different ways based on people's race, their age, their sexual preference, their gender identity. And it's important that we're paying attention to how our actions are contributing to the discriminatory acts against a group of people. As we talk about layers of prejudice, we go into the layers of racism. And so overt racism is pretty obvious. It's hard not to see when somebody is being overtly racist. They tend to use certain words and phrases that once said in public, everybody goes, oh no, did you really say that? And we've seen videos of this on social media over and over and over again, or people's tweets from years past, or pictures of them dressed a certain way that makes us realize that no, this was not okay, this was intentional, and this is harmful to a group of people. Structural racism is the systemic ways in which policies and practices in our institutions, as well as in our country at large, really are impacting and reinforcing the discrimination against a group of people, causing us to have an inequitable community. And so, just really quickly, I'd like if everybody could, if anybody who wants to contribute, could give me some examples of structural racism that they have seen, or systemic racism that they have seen in our community. I'll just give you a little time. So I see people answering: our education system, definitely, criminal justice laws, redlining, and I see a lot of the redlining coming up. Voting, or voting suppression, gentrification and housing, prison and the judicial system, and healthcare, and the placement of the 95. Good. So I'm going to show a brief video about that in a little bit. Now, microaggressions. Microaggressions are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights, snubs, insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate, whether it's hostile, derogatory, or sometimes just negative messages that targets a group of people based on the identity that they have. And I'm going to go really a little bit more in depth about microaggressions in a few slides. Let's talk about systemic racism for a bit. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this video before, but let's really go and see what it's about.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So as you can see from that video, they have some really good examples of systemic racism that you all already verbalized in the chat after that question. So to get into microaggressions are usually sometimes invisible and don't necessarily allow the person saying the words or doing the action to realize how hurtful it may be to the individuals who feel offended by it. I've been told when I do this slide a lot that I am too much of a fan of PC culture and I just want everybody to be politically correct all the time. And I responded once to somebody that if you're telling somebody something hurts your feelings, wouldn't you want that person to stop doing the thing that hurts your feelings? Why would the person then go, I don't care what your feelings are, I'll continue to do it regardless, when it's someone is verbalizing and explaining how a statement or an action may have been harmful? A lot of the times when people do verbalize the microaggressions that they've experienced, a lot of the response is that the person will deny that they meant any harm, or, it was just a joke, or, maybe you're misunderstanding, or you're just being too sensitive right now. And that, in fact, can inflict even more hurt and more pain on the individual, as constant microaggressions sometimes lead to not only physical illnesses and based on the stress that people are experiencing, but also mental health issue and a disruption in their treatment, as well as disruption in their relationships. This was a activity that was done at Fordham by a photographer who, and it was just an experimental activity for one of her courses, when she asked some of her peers and classmates to write down microaggressions that they've encountered. And microaggressions aren't specific to only one particular group of people. Lots of individuals from different varied backgrounds can experience microaggressions. And so some of the examples, I'll read them out loud because not everybody can always see them. Starting at the top, you'll see somebody was asked, no, where are you really from? The second one, she's been told, Courtney, I never see you as a Black girl. And the idea behind that is that there is just one monolith version of what Blackness should be. I remember when February started earlier this year, I had a friend who posted a meme on social media, and the meme that she posted was, I'm always Black, but for this month, I'm going to be Blackity Black. And somebody's comment under that was like, well, what kind of Black are you going to be? Are you going to be Michelle Obama Black, or are you going to be Cardi B Black? And my friend's response was, I'm going to be both. Because Black people, Black individuals aren't just one set standard of actions and culture. We're so varied in so many different ways and have so many different backgrounds that influences who we are. The guy in the middle statement is, you don't act like a normal Black person, you know, as in, once again, there's only one idea of Blackness. The Asian girl said that she's been asked, can you see as much as white people, you know, because of your eyes? At the end, she says that she was asked, so what does your hair look like today? And this was said as the person pulled off her hat without her permission. I always like to pause here just to explain to individuals who may not be aware, touching a Black woman's hair is a really sensitive matter, especially touching a Black woman's hair without her consent. And a lot of times people feel if I'm in a familiar setting or I have a familial relationship with the individual and we're close, then that, you know, I'm not doing it to be offensive, I'm doing it to be affectionate or because I'm curious. And I've had individuals who I absolutely have never met in life who have come up and stroked my hair. I just want to break and give a little historical context to why that's offensive. Something so simple that we may consider a microaggression may have a lot more meaning to the individual that's being affected by it. Because historically, a lot of the times, Black women were treated at sideshows. They were treated as a feature and as animals that people could come and touch without their consent because they had no ownership over their own bodies. There were women who were featured in circuses and transported throughout the globe. And, you know, part of the act was that people could come up and they could touch their bodies and touch their hair just to get the sensation of being close to this wonderful, wonderful novelty, even though that person was a human being with feelings and emotions themselves. And while that may not be the state of the world today, it is still a historical factor that resonates with us when we are being touched or, you know, stroked without us giving permission to other people to make those types of action. So at the bottom, to continue, the person says, well, you don't speak Spanish, because the idea, if you are from a Hispanic or Latino culture, then to be a real Latina, she has to speak the language. The second girl says that she was told, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl. The guy in the middle says, well, you're not really Asian. The guy said that he's been asked, so like, what are you? Which is something you hear a lot, especially for individuals who may be ambiguous and may not be easily identifiable as one particular race. And then the girl at the end was told, why do you sound white? Because of course, voices have color. So to really talk a little bit more about how microaggressions really affect individuals, I would like to show this video.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping.
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work.
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins' name for the culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Giving me shopping advice. I live here too.
I'm getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Touch your hair.
Multiple times a day.
Pretty good hair. Touch your hair.
It's fucking annoying. It makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes. It just seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite.
Okay. So as we talk about the layers of prejudice and the layers of racism, it's important that we address privilege. I think when people hear the word privilege, a lot of the times you see a defensive nature come up because people get the idea that to say that someone has privilege means that they've never suffered or had any stressors in their life that have affected them. Having privilege does not mean that your life hasn't been hard. Having privilege doesn't mean that you haven't gone through hardships of any kind. Having privilege does not mean that you haven't had to work for what you have now. But what privilege really means is that there is a special right, advantage, or immunity that is granted to your particular person or the group you identify with based on that identity. And it's usually unearned, and it usually goes unidentified by the individual that has the privilege. I like to think and consider myself as a variety of different minorities. I am Black, but I am also female, and I am also an immigrant in this country. And so I can clearly see the disadvantages that I have not been afforded based on those individual identities when compared to individuals who may have privilege by being in their specific groups. However, I still have privilege from being in certain other groups as well. And it's important to recognize and reflect and challenge those privileges to be able to help change the systemic issues that our country has gone through. One of the privilege that I always consider, and I was actually just talking about this with my mother a few days ago, is I am able-bodied. I'm an able-bodied individual who doesn't have to worry or even be concerned about a lot of the things. In fact, I wake up in the morning and I don't think about the fact that I'm able-bodied because it's not something that really affects the way I navigate through my life. If I have to go to the store, or I have a job interview, or I have to get to an appointment by a certain time, then I get up, I get dressed, I drive there. If I find a close parking space to the building, I get excited. Oh my gosh, I don't have a long walk. But if there's none, I drive around a few times and I park wherever I need to park. I start thinking about my privilege when I have to drive my mother to places, as she has a disabled parking decal and she's only able to really navigate in certain spaces. And I reflect on the privilege that I have and things that I don't have to consider, because one of the things that she does a lot is she gets ready extra early. If she has to get somewhere by 4, she's ready to leave the house by 2:30, because she knows that when she gets there, she's going to have allowances made for her ability to get into the places she needs to get into. And I remember driving up to somewhere before with her, and the 2 single parking spaces that were at the front of the building that were designated for her parking decal were already filled. And so with my able-bodiedness, I was like, okay, we'll just park somewhere else. And she reminded me that she's not able to. She's like, I can't park from back there because that's too long of a walk for me to get to where I need to go. And of course, I had to drive around, drop her at the front, then find parking. But it's something that's always on her mind because there are disadvantages to her navigating through her life, whereas it's not something I have to consider because of the privilege I have. And so it's always important to not necessarily become defensive when somebody points out your privilege, but to really reflect on how it assists you in navigating your life and how that person may not be able to benefit by having such privilege. And so I am going to take a short break here and see if there's anyone that has any questions that they would like me to address at this time. And so my coworkers, Rafis and Elkin, are helping me with that to let me know if there's any questions that have come up.
Hey, Aisha. So just a couple of questions we answered in the Q&A. One question is, I'm Jewish American and I have dark curly hair. I get asked all the time if I'm Hispanic. And when you say I'm not, they say, wow, you look like you're Spanish. Would this be considered a microaggression?
Yes, I would consider that a microaggression because it's an assumption that's made on me based on my appearances. And then a judgment comes with that assumption. I've had a few friends actually who are mixed race and multiracial. My childhood best friend is Black and white, but she looks Hispanic, and we've been in situations in public before where people have approached her and just started to talk to her in Spanish, or people have made the assumptions that she needs a Spanish speaking staff member when we enter into places. And when she verbalizes that, no, I'm not, you know, there's kind of like a prejudgment, like, are you trying to deny your race? Are you trying to deny your background? Are you trying to deny your heritage? Or why can't you speak Spanish? You should be able to. And so there are microaggressions that a lot of individuals may encounter based on their identity and what people's expectations of that identity will be. Any other questions? I see the chat box is going off, but I can't check all that right now.
And I just wanted to remind everyone that when you are submitting your questions, please make sure that you click to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your feedback or your feedback in the chat box. So make sure that when you are making a comment that you do address it to the all panelists and attendees portion.
Okay. All right, if there's no more questions at this time, I'm going to just continue. Thank you for your help. Oh, somebody did have a question. Before I continue, I just want, somebody says, one thing I hate is that I am mestizo, I hope I pronounced that right, which is a mix of Spanish with indigenous people, but I never see mixed Hispanic anywhere. I don't know why it bothers me. Any advice? I think that's just something to address in like, or systems change and building more awareness. I remember when I first came to this country and I had to fill out applications, all the applications that I would fill out said African American. And I don't identify as African American. I wasn't born in America. My heritage is not African American. And so I would never tick it. I would always tick other. And then I would write in Black, because that was the identity. And I think sometimes, you know, people's expectation is, but isn't African American the political correct way? But then it left out a whole group of the African diaspora that may live in this country but weren't necessarily born in this country. And over time and over the years, I've seen that has ultimately changed. Now they sometimes have Black/African American or just Black, but it's hard having ownership over your identity when other people aren't giving you that ownership that you need. So just to get into racial trauma now, race-based traumatic stress has severe effects on someone's mental health and their physical health. It can be a result of racial harassment, witnessing racial violence, or experiencing the institutional and systemic racism that is very prevalent in our country. And this trauma sometimes results in people having symptoms that are very similar to a lot of the mental health symptoms from other diagnoses, such as depression, anxiety, suffering from a low self-esteem or low self-worth, feeling humiliated because of your identity, feeling as if you can't connect with individuals because of that identity, having cognitive issues such as concentration problems and memory problems, as well as mood instability such as irritability. It's important that I point out that not everybody who experiences racism and discrimination is going to develop all these symptoms of race-based trauma. It's just like with PTSD, not everyone who goes through a traumatic event or has experienced a traumatic incident in their life will go on to absolutely develop PTSD. However, a person will be more inclined to develop these symptoms the more frequent and the more they occur in their life. And everybody is different. Some people's level of coping and resiliency is different versus somebody else who may have gone through the exact same experiences or events. Now, the symptoms for both racial trauma and PTSD looks very, very, very alike. However, PTSD is usually very specific to events that have happened, whether it's sexual abuse, a serious injury, exposure to death or threat of death, or an event that was catastrophic in that person's life. Whereas race-based stress can be triggered by events that are either experienced directly or even vicariously, sometimes even through a third party, such as seeing events through social media and the national news. But that can then have a strain on an individual's mental health if every time I log on to social media, I am seeing videos of people who look like me and who identify as me treated a certain way, then it begins to give me symptomology of PTSD that may make me fearful of going out in the world with this identity. When we talk about race-based stress, I always like to go back to making sure that we do talk about the generational impacts of slavery. Slavery has had a severe impact not only on the minds of Black Americans, but in the culture and the societal factors of the community that we live in. It affects the way that we experience the privileges of the dominant culture, as well as the disadvantages that are faced from the Black community because of the roots of slavery. There's so many underlying effects of slavery and racism that people deal with every single day. And it's important to recognize the value of the strength of individuals, that we have to get up and we face this every single day, but we still have to survive even though we're going through it. I had somebody who told me the other day that they feel as if they're in an abusive relationship with America. And I was like, how so? And their explanation is that, you know, they love their country. They want to live in their country. When they voice their anguish over the states of their country, then there's individuals who are quick to tell them, well, you just need to leave, or why don't you just go, or why don't you move somewhere else? And they're like, but I don't want to move. This is where I want to live. I just want where I live to be better. In talking about the impact of slavery, it's also important that we talk about the epigenetics of trauma. Epigenetics is the interface between nature and nurture, and how our genetic code can be modified based on the experiences of our ancestors before us. This came about through a study that was done on prisoners of war in World War II. And when they started studying prisoners of war from World War II and started to look at the impact of their traumatic experiences on their life, they started seeing similarities in their physical health features, as well as their mental health features that were also going on in their offspring and their grandchildren. And as this study continued, they realized that trauma not only affected the individual who experienced it, but it left a chemical marker on the person's gene that was then being passed down through their children. And so many of the effects of traumatic stress can be transmitted to subsequent generations, whether or not that generation is actually exposed to the trauma themselves. I've had individuals who have told me, like, why are you so angry about slavery? It's over with, it's done. Without taking into concern the fact that the epigenetics of that traumatic experiences has played a part not only on my ancestors' genetic makeup, but also on how my body has interacted and inherited those genetic markers. While also going through the psychosocial stressors that we go through today, 2020, and still having to go through what is very much likely to be the next major civil rights movement. I also want to highlight that I actually chose today for a very specific reason to have this training. I know that you've probably been seeing this posted all through your social media. You're getting notifications from different organizations who are celebrating it. But today, June 19th, which is a combination of June and 19th, is called Juneteenth and is known as Freedom Day in the Black community. And Freedom Day came about because, as we know, in 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that made slavery officially abolished in the United States. There are a lot of stories about why it took so long for other places to recognize it. One of the big ones that I've heard is that in Texas especially, and a lot of the Confederacy, there were individuals who just refused to acknowledge that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed and just kept their slaves going as will. And there's also stories that said that the Union soldiers had difficulties getting into these Confederate states to really pass on the message. And so it wasn't until 2 years later in the stronghold of Texas, that was one of the most distant Confederacy states at the time, that they were finally able to give the news to the slaves themselves that the war had ended 2 years ago and that people who were enslaved were now free. This was met not just with jubilation from the slaves themselves, but also with some trepidation and some fear, because, okay, slavery is over with, but now where do I go? Juneteenth is very representative of the fact that freedom and justice has always been delayed in this country for Black people. Even with the signing of that proclamation, it took 2 years for those plantation owners to let go of the labor that they had from the slaves they kept. But to this day, it also still feels a little delayed when you're going through the world and trying to live while Black. There's been so many instances in the news and on social media and on so many avenues that we've seen individuals who have been judged prematurely and had police called on them only for doing something that anybody else could do, but on the basis of their Black skin. I'm sure that you all know this picture. I think she was titled Barbecue Becky, because she called the police on a group of individuals who were barbecuing at a park, an open park, a public park that had barbecue pits that were set up for the public to use while playing their music and having a nice social setting with their family members and friends. The police was called on them for the pure basis, not that they were doing anything illegal, not that they were doing anything that was dangerous, but really just on the basis of their Black skin. There was another instance, the not waving while leaving an Airbnb. I purposefully always remember that story because I remember that it was Bob Marley. If anybody knows Bob Marley, he's a very famous Caribbean singer. But his granddaughter had been staying in an Airbnb with friends and family for a few days. As they were packing up their luggage to leave the Airbnb, apparently a neighbor saw them leaving the premises, waved at them, and got upset because they didn't wave and smile back at her. Not somebody they knew, not somebody they were familiar with. A perfect stranger got upset that a group of Black individuals did not wave at her as they were leaving a vacation site, and so called the police on them to make sure the police knew that she felt threatened and she was suspicious of them being in her community. And you hear that a lot. You hear individuals, when you hear the phone calls that go through, it's always a threat of harm that this person may do something to me, even though that person hasn't necessarily been doing anything dangerous. The latest one that has been in the media, of course, is the man who was bird watching in Central Park. And while bird watching, felt that he wanted another park attendee to follow the basic rules of keeping her dog on a leash, because there were signs that said that this was the rules of the park in that area that had to be followed. And even though he was on site doing what he did every weekend, and people around were familiar with him enough to know that this is where he comes and this is where he goes and this is what he does, the phone call that ensued was that he had the police call on him with the threat that he was an African-American male who was threatening her life, all by simply asking the person to put their dog on a leash. And this happens over and over. And as an individual of color, when I'm watching the news or when I'm logging onto social media and I see this happen over and over, it becomes fearful to go out in the world with my Black skin, because I don't know at what moment somebody may figure that I am a threat based really just on the matter of my skin color. And we all know that sometimes that threat can become fatal to individuals. There are individuals who have had their lives taken away from them very, very shortly. And we say their names and we make them into hashtags. And this slide is always particularly hard for me to do, because every time I have done this training, every time I do this training, the next time I do it, I have to update this slide because there's always a new name. In fact, I did a practice session last week where I was practicing and going over with some colleagues of mine, and I was going over this presentation. And as we got to this slide, another coworker mentioned, hey, remember there's a new name. A new name happened that you have to add to this. And it becomes repetitive that when you hear in the news that people are being killed at a higher rate than other ethnic backgrounds and other races, it becomes a fearful thing for me to go out into this world being Black, because I don't know if my name will end up as a hashtag. And that's something that we live with at the forefront of our mind, that other people don't necessarily have to always consider as they navigate this world. So we're going to pause, and I do have another poll, and this poll is really just focused on the ethnic makeup of the Latino and Hispanic community that's participating. So I really just want to see, what do you identify best as, and what do you prefer to call yourself? All right, we're going to end the poll. Thank you for participating, everybody. And the primary ones were Latino, Hispanic, and Caribbean. Thank you. And then, of course, there's some Afro-Latina, Afro-Hispanic individuals in here. Thank you. So as we get into the ethnic trauma that occurs in the Latino and Hispanic community, there has been some studies throughout the past several years on the experiences of the Latino and Hispanic community in our country. And it has shown, those studies have reported that there has been so much discrimination, especially in healthcare and in other system places. And what the reports also showed case was that there weren't necessarily any protective factors against the discrimination. A lot of times when you hear of individuals who report that they have been treated a certain way, there's a sense of respectability. Well, maybe if you talk like that, or maybe if you acted this way, or maybe if you dressed a certain way, you wouldn't have to experience that. But from the report that this came out of, they actually stated that having a college degree or being born as a US citizen did not protect them against the discrimination that they experienced. And they also reported that individuals with darker skin colors said that they were treated more unfairly on a regular basis than Hispanic and Latinos who said that they were of a lighter skin complexion, which then becomes the dichotomy of not only my ethnic background, but also my racial identity, then having an impact in how individuals treat me and how I'm able to navigate. So this was from one of the reports showing the percentage of Latinos that said that they have personally experienced discrimination in different areas. You can see in the highest areas, they have said that they experienced discrimination when applying for jobs, as well as when they were being paid or being promoted, trying to rent or buy housing, interacting with the police, seeking health care, applying or attending college, and trying to vote and participate in politics were what they noted were the top areas that they have felt they experienced these types of actions. In fact, over the recent years, the anti-immigrant sentiment that has become very prevalent in our political sphere has really increased the amount of discrimination that immigrants said that they've experienced, whether or not they were actually born here, but just on the basis of looking foreign born. And they reported that they were often hostile interactions with community members, as well as the systems and social institutions where they seek services. And a lot of the effects then put them at increased risk for emotional stress, limited financial opportunities, as well as increased social isolation. And the social isolation doesn't necessarily mean as an individual, but sometimes as a community, where they would rather stay in the communities that they're familiar with, where other people speak the language that they speak, because they know that they'll be accepted there, rather than trying to get or seek help in other areas where they're afraid to be judged, or they're afraid that they may not be able to communicate appropriately because of lack of individuals who may speak the language they feel. And of course, this heightens their risk, both in their physical health as well as mental health problems. What was important for me to note in one of the studies is that while individuals say that they've experienced varied forms of discrimination, they also said it has been helpful when they've received words of support while those discriminatory acts were going on. And so you'll see that individuals reported having at least one of the following 4 incidences: discrimination or unfair treatment, being criticized for speaking Spanish in public places, being told to go back to their home country, as well as being called offensive names. And you'll see that this showed the range in which individuals experience it, and not only foreign born, but even second generation and third and higher generation individuals reported still having experiences of being told to go back to their home country, when by the second and third generation, this is in fact my home country and where I was born and where I live. But they also expressed that they've heard support from individuals who have spoken up with them in the public sphere when these acts have gone on, and that has been helpful in decreasing the impact of the discriminatory acts. So once again, I will pause for a few minutes if anybody has any questions that they would like me to address.
Aisha, the question that's come up in the chat box is, can you explain the origin of the term Latinx, not Latino or Latina?
Sure. So the origin of the word, and we have some lively conversation about this with my colleagues.
Yes.
Because I asked my
and maybe is Rafis on? Because I think Rafis
Yeah,
would
I'm
be able to
still
answer
here.
this too.
Yes, Rafis, do you want to get that?
No, you could go ahead, Aisha. I could add to it.
Okay. So the term Latinx really came out of the fact that Latino and Latina are really gender specific to the groups of individuals who identify as it. And as the LGBTQ community really gained the ability to verbalize their wants and needs in society, a lot of them, especially individuals that identify as queer or transgendered or non-binary, felt that the gender-specific terms of Latino and Latina doesn't necessarily really apply to them, especially if they don't identify with the binary terms that gender-specific word really is geared to. And so Latinx came out of a lot of intellectual and a lot more college studies that were done and scientific studies that were done that was really meant to have a wider range and be more inclusive of individuals who didn't necessarily have that binary gender identity. And so a lot of people in the activist circles are leaning more towards the Latinx, but I did notice that when I asked the question, nobody in this group used that term. And I found that when I asked individuals in my life who I'm familiar with in both my family and my friend group, I prefer to ask people what they prefer. Because I've even had disputes over individuals who prefer being called Hispanic instead of being called Latino. And so one of the things that I try to do is I ask individuals like, well, do you like this word? Would you like me to call you this word? And if they say no, okay, fine, no. If they say yes, then I'm going to use that as their preferred term because I want to make sure that everybody has a level of comfort in how they're being addressed. So anything to add, Rafis?
No, I think that was pretty good. I think that many people also in the chat were identifying themselves as Afro-Latina or a difference. So there is a diversity, but it comes from Latino or Latina, just basically you don't want to, the gender. I find that also in many academics or research or published work, you find that. Also, it seems to be more on the West Coast than the East Coast as well. But that's what it refers to. We want to take out the O, the A instead of the Latino because I'm asking myself, that's what it comes down to it. But I like that some people in the chat corrected and also identified themselves in a different way. I know that someone mentioned that she was mestiza because she means that she's comes from Latin America and also has some Aboriginal in her blood. So it's important. I like your suggestion to ask people, how do you define yourself? Especially because we have Latino that come from South America and from the Caribbean and South Florida as well. And it's very different Latin America from Latin America than from the Caribbean experience.
So I see.
We have another question that I wanted to read to you. It's something I've struggled with is knowing when it's appropriate to assist or stand up for a person who's being victimized by microaggressions. I don't want to speak over them, presume to speak for them, or give the impression that they are weak or incapable without a white passing person's help. yet staying silent doesn't feel right either. It's easy to know how to respond to avert racism and violence. However, when things are more understated or conversational, it's difficult to know how to proceed, so how do you think allies and or white passing individuals can be supportive in this kind of situation?
That's a really good question. And I struggle with that myself, with other identities that I consider myself an ally of. Like, I don't want to defend you if you're not offended, but I also don't like to let things pass that I feel will continue the offense. I think one of the things is, first of all, it's important to ask the person what they want. If you have the opportunity to speak with the individual that you feel was victimized by microaggression, in private or on a personal level, you can point out to them that, hey, I wasn't comfortable when so-and-so said this. Were you comfortable, or did this bother you? A lot of the times, to be honest, the individual may tell you no, if they were fine. Not because they actually were, but because it becomes exhausting sometimes to address every single microaggression that happens in your life. It becomes exhausting to always bear the brunt of the offense and then have to hear people justify why they said what they said or did what they did. And so you may see a microaggression occur and the person may not react to it, because we've learned to, the best analogy I can use, and if anybody has never heard of this, I would compel you to just Google the poem "We Wear the Mask" by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And it really just is a poetic way of showing how a lot of the times, to really and successfully get through the society that we live in, we tend to put a mask on with a presentation and a facade that shows that nothing really bothers us. And so I would ask allies, one, to talk to individuals if you're close enough to them, to ask if they were hurt, they were harmed, they were offended. But sometimes there's things that may seem as if they're microaggressions that for individuals are pretty overt. I'll use a quick example. When COVID-19 in March, when it was first affecting our community, I recall being in a meeting with an individual one day, and the individual made a comment about feeling wary of buying Chinese food for lunch because they didn't know what they would necessarily have and I instantly was like, oh, no, we're not going to say that. We're not going to judge all Asian businesses and restaurants because of the mere fact that this is where this disease originated. We're not going to say that we should be fearful of going into those spaces because of the association that you're making, that there's somebody to be fearful of in this time. And I was very quick to address it because I'm not Asian, I don't identify as Asian, but I could see where that continued type of thinking could contribute to individuals forming those implicit bias and discriminatory actions against a group of people just simply based on their identity. And so sometimes if you feel safe enough to address it, if you feel comfortable, I would say you can speak up. But also I think it's important to give the power to the individuals who are affected as well, and make sure that you're not like you said, that you're not overstepping them and you're not speaking on their behalf. So hopefully that answers that.
Yes, so another question I think that came in actually through the chat box that I think is important to address is, someone asked a question. I think that if a person becomes, I'm sorry, the chat box is moving. So the question was around how do you, the statement is, there's nothing without us. So how do you as a white person show up for Black and brown people without centering yourself? And Aisha, I'll quickly share and give an example. So there's a white colleague that I have that works in this space, and she has worked in the racial equity space for 20 plus years. And I've observed her that when we go into meetings, she is first silent. She listens, and I can see her taking notes, and I can see her, you know how you can visually see someone thinking, right? And then she responds, and her response never centers herself. It always centers the individuals, the groups that she is working to serve. So, and then what she also does is she uses her place of privilege and power to amplify voices of Black and brown folks. So if you're a white ally, I would suggest that is how you amplify the work, and that is how you do the work alongside us, is that you first listen, right? Educate yourself. And then when you have the opportunity, especially when you're in a position of power, you make sure that you're amplifying those voices and not centering yourself in the discussion.
I agree. I know the exact person that you're thinking of, and she does something that I say is, I call give space. She gives space for individuals of those identities to voice their needs and concerns, even though she may have the clinical background and expertise and academic knowledge to really push the movements ahead. But she gives space to the voices that need to be heard so that it's coming from them. I can try to fix everybody's problem, but I don't really know how it's affecting the persons that are experiencing it without them being able to tell how they're experiencing it. And I think that's an important thing for allies of any population. I consider myself an ally of the LGBT community, but I can't speak about the LGBT community because that's not my personal identity. And it's important that I give those who do identify from that background the space to really move ahead when given that opportunity. Any other questions? We can do 2 more.
We have 2 more in the Q&A. In this season, how are you coping with the issues facing us today? What would be your advice to us to this racial tension? So I'm assuming this question is about self-care. What are we doing to take care of ourselves during these times?
So that one's a hard one for me, and I can see the name of the person who put it. I've cried almost every day for the last 3 weeks. I've woken up and I have declared that today I will not cry. Today I will be strong, because of course, as a Black woman, I have to draw upon my strength even in times of distress, because that's what we're told to be. That's what we're trained to do. And then it'll hit me at 11 p.m. that night and I'll start crying. And one of the things that I have found to be helpful for my self-care is having the ability to talk about my experiences with a selected group of individuals who know me and understand me, and having the connection with individuals that I can be transparent and I can be honest and I can share how things are bothering me, and I can then, really feel compelled to wanting to make sure that I also give them the ability to share their experiences and what's going on for them. So one thing I'll say to that question is, how am I coping? Not very well. But but I also told myself that I can't just get up and cry every day. I also have to do something about it. I have to make sure that my voice is heard in whatever way my voice is heard. For some individuals, that means, going out and marching and holding signs and shouting to make sure that voice is heard. For some individuals, it's spreading knowledge and educating others. And for some, it's just making sure that you have a really, really, really good support system. I think that's the most important part of today, having a good support system and knowing when not to engage with things that are going to cause you to feel more strain and more racial stress. Whether that's, for me, not logging onto social media for a couple of days because I can't see the repeated videos and posts. And that's important. Like if I keep seeing it, I'm going to keep crying. So I'm just not going to go into that realm at all. Or just having support system where I can call people and talk to them and really share how these experiences are triggering for me and how it's affecting me. So, and a last question.
Question is, one moment.
There's another question.
You want to read that? Want to read that, Rafis?
Yeah, there's a question from a gentleman. How can I teach my 5-year-old foster kid to talk to us or his mother reunify when he suffered a microaggression? I worry about him sometimes. So someone is concerned about their a son, once his child, male son, once he gets reunified with his mother.
So I think we think that kids don't understand a lot of the times. And one of the things is it's because it's a protective factor. It's a protective thing. I don't want to expose kids to, the dangers of the world because I'm afraid of their emotional health. Um, but understand this, even if they're not directly exposed to things, even if they're not directly witnessing to things, kids are still very much picking up the cues and the emotions of the people around them. And I always, when I was a clinician and I worked with youth, one of the things that I always tried to point out to parents was to talk about them. Make sure you're talking about these issues. Maybe you're not showing them actual videos. Maybe you're not, exposing them to the images that are strenuous to you. But giving the kids the ability to identify their emotions and talk about how those emotions are affecting them gives them the power to then come to you, because a lot of the times we may not always be around them when these things are happening, and so we may not know what's going on. And with children especially, mental health symptoms don't look like adult mental health symptoms. It may not be crying, it may not be depression, it may not be staying in bed all day. Sometimes it's behavioral problems, a lot of anger, a lot of irritability, a lot of throwing things and being destructive indicates that there's something going on with these kids that goes far beyond them just having a behavior or oppositional problem. And so I think it's important to, one, teach them how to identify emotions, teach them how to verbalize those emotions. Okay, your tummy hurts because you feel bad. Well, could it be that you're upset? Is that why your tummy is hurting? Are you angry? Are you sad? What is causing your body to feel the way it feels? And then there are a lot of videos out there, especially on YouTube, about ways that we can interact with kids and ways that we can really, really teach them what's going on right now and really talk to them. I think the best thing that I sat down that Saturday morning and watched Sesame Street Town Hall on CNN, and my kids are extremely young. They're almost 3 and 2. They had no grasp of what was going on the TV except when Elmo came on. Oh, it's Elmo! And that was fascinating to them. But it gave a lot of the parents that were watching the verbiage and the ability to really navigate how to talk to especially young kids about what they're experiencing and then what they're seeing in the world today. So I know that there's a couple other questions, but I'm going to leave them till the end because we'll have another section just so that I can continue with the presentation. Thank you guys for the questions. These are good. I was worried that doing this virtually, I wouldn't have audience interaction, but you guys are interactive.
Yes.
I appreciate it. So what are some of the symptoms of racial trauma? Some of the symptoms from racial trauma looks like a lot of vigilance and suspicion, especially suspicion of social institutions. When you live in a community or you come from a racial or ethnic background where you have dealt with systemic issues throughout your lifetime, you start to become suspicious of how will this really help me when I've been so negatively impacted by them my whole life. And so that includes trusting people and having a lack of trust or even avoiding eye contact with individuals. One thing that I will say about eye contact, and I say this every training I do because I always like to point it out, is that eye contact is a very Americanized and westernized ideology of showing respect and attention. The idea that I have to look directly at you all the time to show you that I have respect for you and I'm paying attention, very Americanized, very westernized. A lot of people from a lot of cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds outside of the United States don't necessarily show very direct eye contact when interacting with people who are older than them or people that they may consider being an authority figure, whether in school or the criminal justice system or just in their business atmosphere. And so it's important that you really are aware that not everybody who is looking down while you're trying to talk to them is being disrespectful. I had this issue when I first came to this country. I came to this country during my high school years. And I can tell you this, I was taught growing up that when I am being spoken to by my elders, I need to be respectful and I need to make sure that I'm talking to them like this. And I remember the first time it became an issue for me when I was in high school here was I was talking to a teacher and she said, "Look at me when I'm talking to you. You're being very disrespectful right now." And I went, "Okay." And that's when I learned, and when it was explained to me that she thought I was being deceitful and I was lying because I wasn't looking at her directly. Um, and so just be aware that people's cultural backgrounds may differ from yours or differ from the expectation of or community. And so it may not necessarily align with what you think the right way of acting should be. Increased sensitivity to threat, always being defensive or at a heightened state. Especially in new situations or risky situations, increased psychological as well as physiological symptoms. Trauma not only affects our mental health, but trauma plays a huge negative impact on our emotional health and our physical health, especially with decreasing our immune system functioning. And when you look at the health disparities in our country, as well as the populations that are at higher risk for chronic immune system diseases, you'll see that the Black population has a heightened risk of a lot of the diseases that are caused because of the decrease in their immune system functioning and the heightened stress impact on their body. Increased alcohol and drug use, because why might a person with trauma use alcohol and drugs? Sometimes it's really to cope and be able to get through and be able to wake up and survive every single day. And we have a very negative view of any type of substance use when we hear of substance use in our country because of the way that it has been presented to us without truly understanding that there's a lot of different reasons that lead people to use whatever substances, but a lot of the times it may be their way of trying to manage their pain and unresolved traumas. Increased aggression, especially in terms of defiant behaviors that we see a lot in schools and in our communities. I always like to point out street gangs to people because along with um, substance use, gang activity tends to get a very hard rep. Not to say that they're good things to be in. However, a lot of the times when I've interacted with individuals, whether in the criminal justice system or the jails or the juvenile detention center that have been affiliated with gang, it's always been eye-opening to me to hear their reasoning for joining these gangs. And a lot of the words that I hear them say over and over again is family. It was somewhere that they were accepted, something that gave them a social network, something that was supportive when they didn't necessarily have support in other ways, or it was a protective reason because of threats of harm to them. And this was a avenue for them to be able to have people that they knew would have their back. And so, you know, really implying that this was more for their gain rather than the detrimental reasons that we associate with gangs. And then having a narrowing sense of time, always feeling as if people, I'm in chronic danger and not necessarily having long-term goals because I may view dying as, you know, something that's going to happen to me pretty soon based on the fact that this is what I've seen in my community and this is what I know to happen rather than a longevity in life and making a real sense of future for myself. Some of the other effects of trauma is statistics have shown that 20% of Black Americans reported having more serious psychological distress than their white counterparts, and they tend to suffer from higher levels of stress, anxiety, and emotional trauma, as well as the physiological effects of having higher levels of stress-related illnesses and chronic diseases. Mental Health America also gave out a report in the past few years that indicated that for the first time in history, they're seeing a heightened rate of Black youth that are attempting suicide than white youth. Before it was thought that Black youth didn't attempt suicide at such high rates, but over the past few years, I think, especially in the age range of 8 to 13, Black males were at the highest risk and had the highest rate of death by suicide. Some of the barriers that we see in individuals that experience racial trauma or experience any type of mental health concerns in getting the help And this, of course, is not an inclusive list. This is not all the reasons, but I would not have the time or the space to get into everything. One is distrust. We talked about that. Distrust of the very system that keeps us marginalized. Distrust of the very system that has systemically played against our population. Distrust in the ways that we have experienced healthcare in the past and how that has affected us. One of the things that I hear from people all the time was, well, if people need help, they can just go get the help, without understanding that there's historical components that contribute to the distrust that the Black population especially may have in the system. When you hear about stories of the Tuskegee trials, and for anybody that have never heard of that, those were medical and scientific studies and reviews that were done on groups of people where they were actually injected with certain diseases and were not told about it. They did not consent, they were not informed, they were not made aware of what was happening to their body. And when you grow up in a culture that you're hearing that this is what happens, it's easy to become distrustful of the system because you may not be certain of what will happen to your body without your consent and without you being informed as well. A clash of cultural values, and that occurs when, especially in situations where you may not have individuals that share your ethnic background or racial makeup, and so trying to have communication or trying to be understood doesn't necessarily come easily. Feeling a lack of representation, feeling as if I obviously I love memes. I talk in memes in real life. I saw a meme the other day that somebody said, the reason why I need a Black therapist is that I need to have a person who's going to understand when I make certain phrases like, yo, that made me tight. And I laughed my head off because instantly I knew exactly what that phrase meant. But that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who doesn't have that shared cultural background is going to understand what that phrase means. And so, been in situations where you have to explain yourself over and over, or you feel misunderstood, may make the person feel more stressed out than they necessarily need to be. Less likely to have health insurance because of our systemic disparities, having a lack of connectedness, shame regarding their values, or shame at being diagnosed with a mental illness. In a lot of racial and cultural backgrounds, there is a huge stigma with having mental health concerns. I've been told by clients that, miss, I'm not crazy, or, only white people need therapists. And the idea that as a Black person, this is not something I should engage in, can limit people's ability to really seek and get the help that they want. Having financial worries, not only about access to care, but having financial worries where I don't have time to take off my job to go get the care I need. If I'm trying to seek out a therapist and the therapist office hours are 9 to 5 and I have to work from 9 to 5, then I'm less likely to want to take time off my job because I have bills to pay to go seek this help. We talk about the inequities of healthcare again, worry about the power dynamics in relationship or misunderstanding the process of therapy, the conflict between therapy and an individual's faith and spirituality. And I do talk about how faith and spirituality plays a part in the cultural considerations later on, but it's important to understand that for a lot of cultural groups, having a strong faith and spiritual background is really a protective factor in them being able to get through their days and get through their experiences and get through the traumas that they go through. For some individuals, we were taught growing up, and we were taught by our elders, and we were taught by the church we attended that I do not have control, God has control. And so God will take care of this. And so being introduced to therapy and being introduced to the idea that if I have a problem, I should go to this human being instead of going to the God I serve, sometimes can become conflicting, because what is this saying about me seeking out this human being? Does that mean that my faith isn't strong enough? Does that mean that I don't believe in God and trust him to do what he needs to do? And that conflict may keep individuals from seeking out the help that they need. And just concern about how their interaction with the providers or other groups or the mistrust in general can really cause a huge barrier to people seeking the help that they need. So how do we cope with racial trauma? How do individuals get through the day with the experiences that they're constantly having? Constant affirmation and acknowledgement. It's important that especially individuals who are serving um, this population and the professionals in their life understand and accept the racial issues that individuals may verbalize that they're going through. It's important to open the door to have this dialogue about issues related to race. I've been in so many spaces where things have happened and occurred to me, and I have felt uncomfortable with verbalizing my personal feelings because I won't be affirmed, or it will be brushed off, or I will be told I'm taking things too seriously, or it's too sensitive. And that it becomes kind of like a pressure cooker where every time this happens, I'm keeping it in, I'm keeping it in, I'm keeping it in, but my pot hasn't been opened enough for me to let go of the pressure that's building inside. Creating a space for race, having open dialogue in our communities, this is hard for us to do, especially because I come from a generation, or I come from my parents come from a generation that taught me that there were certain things that shouldn't be addressed in the workplace. You don't talk about religion in the workplace, you don't talk about politics in the workplace, and you sure don't talk about your racial problems in the workplace. And that then leads us into spaces where when I do verbalize an issue that has arisen based on my race, it may not be easily acceptable. I always like to bring up, when I talk about creating a space for race, there is a support group that's called the Emotional Emancipation Circle that happens in our community. It is held at different places. It's held at South Florida Wellness Network on certain Wednesdays of the month. It has been held at the African American Library at certain other days of the month, and in other spaces in the community. But what the Emotional Emancipation Circle really does, it allows Black and Brown identifying people to come and sit and just talk. What happened today? And of course, given the state of our community right now, they've been doing virtual sessions, which they've been advertising through their social media. And it just allows people to have that space to say, hey, I had a really hard day today. I remember attending one of their meetings where somebody just brought up the fact that as a gay Black male, he has a hardship talking with his Black associates about his gay life, and he has an issue talking with his gay friends about his Blackness. And he is like, I just always feel at conflict and not able to really talk about my true self and what's going on in either of this world with the other participants. And being in that space gave him the ability to say, hey, this is how I feel as a Black gay male, and this is what happened to me this week, and this is why. And there's no judgment. It's not for somebody to try to fix his problem, but it gives him the space to have that dialogue. And of course, racial storytelling, where we share our experiences, we think about the events in our life, and give other people the ability to hear how our lives have been affected by the wounds of the racial trauma we've gone through. Some other ways of coping with racial trauma is the process of naming. Before PTSD was identified as an actual diagnosis, people were fearful of the individuals who had those symptoms. People didn't know how to handle the individuals who had those symptoms. People didn't know what they were looking at, and people didn't know how to deal with them and how to help them. As the field has evolved, and as we're becoming more aware of the experiences that people go through, being able to name something gives people the ability to not feel as if it's just a nameless condition that only I'm going through and nobody else will understand. And then helping people to rechannel their rage. I spoke very openly earlier about the fact that I've cried every day for 3 weeks. I've also been angry every day for 3 weeks. I have been angry at the state of the world, and fearful that my children are going to still have to be marching for the same things, the same basic human rights and dignity 20 to 30 years from now. But having that support group helping me navigate how I can channel that rage into more productive matters help me to feel empowered that I'm actually pushing the needle and moving ahead. And so giving people the space to not only identify their emotions, but also realize that those emotions don't have to consume them, and they can be empowered because of those, whether through actual activism or whether through self-care strategies and having, really healthy support networks and spending time with their family, whatever works best for them. I would always want to make sure that I mention intersectionality whenever I do this training. Intersectionality was a phrase that was developed by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in about 1989. And intersectionality really spoke to how the different identity markers that individuals have can affect them by a number of discriminations and disadvantages, whether it's their race, their class, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, cultural background, or any other identity markers can intersect with each other and overlap in facing prejudices, as well as some of the privileges that they may have. And it recognizes that these identity markers do not exist independently. I don't experience certain discrimination only for being Black, and then certain discrimination only for being female, and there's certain things only for being an immigrant. Sometimes those things counteract, sometimes they conflict, sometimes the discrimination is similar because of all those backgrounds. And sometimes my intersectionalities don't match up. And so I spoke earlier about the individual who identified as a gay Black male, and he spoke about the fact that he had certain stigmas that he experienced from his cultural background and from his ethnic makeup, because his sexual identity and orientation weren't necessarily easily acceptable because of that culture. And so he talked about how it was conflicting for him sometimes to be his true self in all the spheres of his life. And so there may be different prejudices that people face based on the different identities, and then that overall impacts their mental health. And it's important we're taking people's intersectionality into consideration, because something may be applicable for one person's identity that's not necessarily applicable for another of their identity markers. So I try to strive away from the phrase cultural competency, just because cultural competency was the idea of us learning about different cultures and developing a competence in being able to truly and properly deal with everyone from that background. But as we have learned throughout the years, it's really based on a continuum, and nobody ever becomes truly cultural competent. I can immerse myself all I want about somebody's particular culture and someone's identity and learn all the background and all the information that I think is applicable to that group of people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody from that group is going to identify the same or going to have the same needs. And so we have strived towards the continuum that really is about cultural awareness, being aware not only of other people's cultural backgrounds and their differences in attitudes and values, but also being aware of my own culture and how it counteracts with individuals' cultures. And then cultural sensitivity is a part of the continuum that enables us to become more sensitive of how we serve people within our communities and how we're addressing not only the systemic issues, but also how we're addressing the personal offenses people may take. And then, of course, there's cultural humility. And cultural humility is having just a humble and respectful attitude and having an understanding that I am never going to be fully, truly competent and never truly understand everything there is to know about a person. But I can only strive to learn better and only strive to gain more competence in my cultural awareness. And some of those components that I can strive for is the awareness part first, being aware of my own culture, being aware of the prejudices and stereotypes that I have learned through my culture, being aware of how I identify with that culture and what I take away from it. So, you know, I like to big up the fact that I'm Caribbean all the time, but what am I taking away from my Caribbean culture? As well as what am I taking away from my Black culture that intersect with each other, and how I communicate and how I interact with others who may not have that shared identity. Building skills so that we can interact with that diverse groups, and building the skills come in a variety of ways. We don't have to do all of this, but at least paying attention to how am I learning more about other people's culture? Am I going to cultural events? Am I reading books so that I can become more educated about what people's experiences are? Am I going to religious services that may be more applicable to one person's background than my own? Or am I just asking people? Am I asking people questions about their beliefs, about their cultures, about their values that is relevant to me properly being able to learn? I had a friend who messaged me about certain issues that have come up for the Black community. And one of the messages that she said, she premised it at the beginning with, I don't want you to feel as if I'm asking you to always have to educate me about being Black. And she's like, but I want to make sure that I know and I'm gaining a knowledge so that I am, more aware of the issues that people who are Black have to go through. And I immediately was like, I don't take offense to you asking. I'm glad that you're asking. Do I feel that I need to go out and educate every person about my race and about my background? Oh gosh, no. I don't have the energy for that type of emotional labor to always have to answer everybody's question. And I also don't speak on behalf of every Black person that there is. But am I appreciative of the fact that she's making an active effort to learn more and to check herself and check what the knowledge that she's had from before so that she doesn't perpetuate certain stereotypes? I'm very grateful that she's taken that step and building those skills. And then we have to really pay attention to the attitudes that we have. How do our views and opinions differ? And are my views and opinions, while we all like in America to talk about our freedom of speech and our right to say what we want to say, am I making sure that I'm aware of what that freedom of speech really is compelled? My right to say whatever I want to say doesn't necessarily mean it gives me the right to be harmful and offensive to other groups of people. And how am I checking that awareness as I go through my door and as I walk out in the community to make sure that I'm addressing things in a way that does not elicit any harm? And then just gaining knowledge, constantly learning, constantly checking how we assimilate, constantly staying connected in cross-cultural situations, and making sure that we're building that awareness as we go through our society. It's important that when we talk about how to really address racial stress, we differentiate between becoming trauma-informed, which is the gold standard and evidence-based practice that all service providers really strive to, but also that we're paying attention to how healing-centered are we. Trauma-informed doesn't necessarily encompass the totality of a person's experience. Trauma-informed tends to focus on individual experiences and events that lead to individuals developing traumatic symptoms. When a lot of the issues that individuals face regarding race-based stress and trauma is really more a collective issue. Have I ever had a Black male in my family get shot down by a police officer? No, I have not. Am I affected by the many, many news articles of Black males being shot down in the media? Of course I'm affected, even though this is not something that I have personally experienced in my life. Because of the collective nature of my identity, this affects my mental health in such a way that I may not be able to address and identify one specific issue that's leading me to have these symptoms. And so we have to address not only the experiences that people go through, but we have to also be addressing the root causes of trauma, not only in their neighborhoods and schools, but also in their family and the communities that they live. Healing-centered engagement really takes into account a holistic measure of culture, spirituality, civic action, and the collective healing. We can't keep moving forward if the same issues are being perpetuated over and over again, because then the trauma is being perpetuated over and over again. Trauma is not just the isolated experience, but the experiences of just being Black or being Latino and Hispanic in a culture that doesn't necessarily highlight me as important. It's really strength-based and based on the collective nature, and really focusing on people as the agents of change rather than being considered victims of traumatic events. Some of the more innovative models that have really come forth to addressing a lot of the race-based traumatic issues, and as well as the racial-based violence in our community have really come from the concept of restorative justice. And out of restorative justice, we've gotten the ideology of restorative practices that helps to improve relationships between people in their communities. And this is utilized a lot in school settings where a lot of the behavior concerns used to be met with more punitive measures. This is met with the purpose of building a healthier community, healthier relationships, and restoring some of the behavioral concerns rather than the continuation of just punishment to address people's issues. Transformative justice is also an evolution of the restorative justice that really speaks to addressing the acts of harm in our community as a collective whole rather than with punitive measures that are really just geared towards the perpetrators or the victims. And this is this has evolved as a response to not only racial-based stress, but also gender-based oppression and a lot of sexually based violence that have affected individuals of marginalized population. And these models are really just gained a lot of momentum over the past few years in helping to repair our communities in a way that will help us to move forward rather than focus on the individual acts. And just some considerations and strengths when dealing with individuals of ethnic minorities. One of the things that I saw when I was studying trauma-specific certifications was that when they talked about multicultural issues, they had in different sections the different cultural considerations for Native Americans and the Hispanic population and the Black population and Asian. And a lot of this was repetitive to me. A lot of these same considerations and strengths were in each identity. And so when dealing with individuals that may be of from minority groups, it's important to pay attention to what they consider the protective roles. And having strong cultural, racial, and ethnic identity are very much protective roles, including having a very strong family and community support, having a more collective idea of living rather than in an individualistic. You'll be inclined when you go to certain individuals' homes of cultural backgrounds that not only are there multi-generational individuals living in the same home, but they live close to other family members or other supportive individuals in their communities. Their family values are really, really emphasize the importance of their family and the importance of family involvement in their services. You may have situations where you're talking to people from certain backgrounds and a family member is responding for them. And while we want to empower that individual and give them the right to talk for themselves, it's also best that we understand that this may be their social norm, in that family members feel as if they're included in the services that are provided. And practicing cultural traditions is seen as a very, very protective factor. And that is in a variety of ways, whether it's because of their ability to speak their language in their homes and in social settings, whether it's listening to certain music, eating certain foods, or practicing certain cultural norms that are helpful in self-care for them, and also the continuation of making sure that their culture continues, especially when having the expectation that they need to assimilate to an American way of living. And religion is a very huge protective factor in moderating the negative effects. Spirituality and religion allows people to have a connection to something that they feel is greater than them, and it should never be disregarded when giving somebody services. I know that when I was in school, I was taught that, you know, I shouldn't let my ideas of religion conflict with an individual's idea of religion, and I shouldn't push my own idea of religion on them as well. But I've had clients who come into rooms and they're like, Miss, before we start, can I pray to my God? And if that's what works for that person, far be it from me to tell them that no, they're not allowed to do this, because I know the importance and the protective nature of how it will impact their ability to draw upon that strength to really face a lot of the symptoms and traumatic experiences that they go through. And so I always want to end with this South African term, Ubuntu. It means humanness that is found through our interdependence or collective engagement and our service to others. I like to always say that individuals who come in the service field, we don't come into this field with the idea that, oh my God, this is my key for wealth. I'm going to get rich doing this. But more so out of that innate sense of wanting to help others, wanting to be there for others, wanting to take care of others, and wanting to really play a part in the world in making change. And so drawing upon that collective engagement and service is really important. Ubuntu stands for I am because we are. And just to speak really briefly to the picture on the screen, there was a missionary who was sent to a country in Africa, and he talked about the story behind this picture in that as they were doing different activities and different team building activities with the youth, they experienced, they were opened up to what their cultural identity really drove them to do. I think one of the activities that they wanted to do was they wanted them to pass a ball around, passing it from individual to individual to make sure that, you know, they were working on their team building, but the instructions that they gave them was that to pass it in such a way that the ball would never hit the ground. And so the idea that they had when was that they were going to throw it to them and just make sure that they could catch and throw it appropriately. Instead, they formed a circle on the ground where their feet were all connected like this, and the youth started to just pass the ball back and forth towards each other until it just kept going around in a circle, ensuring that it would never fall on the ground, because that collectiveness meant that they dealt with their problems together rather than waiting for one person to mess up and then blaming that person for not throwing or catching it appropriately. And so the I am because we are is a strong phrase that's used to make sure that we're continuing that collectiveness. And so these are some of the resources and some of the studies and papers that have contributed to the information that I provided in today's training. If anybody wants any of these, you can always email me and I can send you some additional information. And then just if we have any more questions, I will get to those in a minute. I just want to make sure that you are aware that I provide our mental health first aid and community trainings here for United Way of Broward County. And also I would implore everybody who was able to tune in today to check out our United Way of Broward YouTube, where we have a documentary that was developed by my colleague Elkin, who's been asking the questions. Faded Conversations. It's really focused on Black mental health, and it is a 22-minute documentary that really addresses just some of the personal experiences that Black males have had with mental health symptoms throughout their lifetime, and really just talking in an open and safe space about what those experiences have been. Thank you guys for tuning in. And do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. So Rafis and I are going to tag team. And before we even get to that, Aisha, I just want to commend you on just an amazing training. And so the chat box is blowing up. You are just extraordinary. And I'm grateful and thankful to work with you and learn with you. And I know at United Way, we're extremely proud of you. And the emotional labor that you did today is to be acknowledged. And so thank you for sharing so much of yourself. So we're going to go ahead to the questions. And Rafis, if you're on, or Ryan, Catherine,
Yes.
we can go back. So,
yes, so just many comments. I think there was a few questions I could summarize into one.
Okay.
And basically is the question of how can you support when you are yourself not identified as Black? So how can I, if I'm not Black, help someone that is hurting or crying? How can I be there for them? Some suggestion.
One suggestion that I would say is to reach out to that person. Like I said, when somebody asked the coping question about how I've been coping, I have several, not just one, not just two, several group chats with friends, family members, and even colleagues that I have been very much like really just pouring out myself to. And I want to say this. I am so grateful to work at United Way of Broward County. I have never been in a space where I have been so extremely grateful for the colleagues that I have and the friendships that I have made. Because I remember during the first week of me just bawling every day, I had white colleagues who reached out to me, and the main question was just, how are you dealing with this? Are you okay? And I've never been in any other space where I've had white colleagues or people who didn't identify as I did that made the effort to reach out to me. None of them asked me how they could fix it. None of them asked me what they should do for me. They really just were checking in with me. And that made a huge difference in how I really was able to reflect on the space that I work in, because it made me aware of the fact that there were individuals who weren't necessarily directly affected by the things that were going on, but still have the cognizance to realize that this affects somebody that I am close to, this affects somebody that I work with, this affects somebody that I interact with, and really show that empathy at a time when I needed that empathy. And so I think even if it may not be your shared identity, reaching out to individuals in times when you see things may be distressful for them really gives that person that positive support system that allows them to have the space to share how they're really being affected by those experiences.
I agree. Thank you so much, Aisha.
I'm going to read the anonymous question first, and then I guess, Rafis, you'll do the second one right after that. This one is,
sure.
How do you deal when others minimize your experience? I had a white colleague get offended and go off because I didn't want a show with a white character on them. As a Black woman with a 1-year-old, I have to overcompensate with Black imagery to help and build my daughter's self-esteem before she faces the world. Instead of seeking to understand my perspective, she pretty much called me a racist, minimizing my experience. What do you do with that when they minimize your experience? So before I'm going to just answer really quickly, and then Aisha,
go ahead.
Yeah, I think, so I don't know if anyone has seen the video. It was a study that was done in the 60s, and then it was done, I think, maybe 10 years ago, and it took a group of Black girls, and it's a doll test, and they had a Black doll and a white doll, and the Black young girls who were 5 and under were asked to pick the doll that they preferred, and over 90% of the time, the Black little girls chose the white doll, because unfortunately, we live in a society where white is idolized, and so we're made to feel that we're less than beautiful, and children feel that early on, though they may not have the words to verbalize that, they feel that very on. So I think, whoever you are, you were trying to explain how you have to be intentional about creating an environment where the color of your daughter's skin is celebrated and is seen as beautiful. And so I challenge all of my non-Black or non-person of color, white colleagues, to really think about that, and sometimes think before we respond, because your response can really be detrimental. And so, as a Black person who, I don't have kids, but I have a niece, I purposely buy her only Black dolls because I want her to see herself as beautiful.
I don't even think I need to answer anything further. I think that was a great answer, Elkin. I remember growing up, my parents were very, very purposeful in only buying me Black dolls, and they made sure that they informed my aunts and their friends that when they purchased things to only buy that. And there used to be like the 1 or 2 people who would give me white dolls, and as a child, I never understood what the issue with that was. But my parents explained to me that, they wanted to make sure that the things that I was associating with was reflective of who I was, because it played such a part in building my esteem. I read a wonderful mini article yesterday from an individual who talked, a Black female who talked about how she developed anti-Blackness, how she really, it became innate in her to be anti-Black, even though she was Black herself, because she never associated her Blackness with anything good. When we associate even Black as an adjective with things, it's always in the negative. Black magic because it's Black, the Black market because it's illegal. So the association of Blackness for her became such a negative that when people would ask her about her race, she would always deflect being fully Black. She would always respond in a way that, oh no, I'm black, but I'm light skinned. Like, I'm not that black. Or I'm black, but I'm mixed with things in a way to negate that black identity, to somehow make herself feel better. And it wasn't until she was older that she was able to really learn that her black identity had beauty within it. And so sometimes from individuals who may not have that shared identity, it's really difficult for them to understand why why your experience may differ from theirs, especially because it's become the norm for things to be more Eurocentric and white in our community. When you go to Walmart, you don't have to think about trying to find a specific image of a Barbie doll, because all the Barbie dolls may look like you. I got really excited in Walmart on Sunday because there was a black doll that also had curly hair. And I got really excited. And then I looked at the price compared to the white doll, and I was like, why is it 3 times the price of the white doll? So not only is it hard to find, but then it costs more, and I'm less likely to want to buy it because I can't afford it. But it's important that when individuals minimize your experience, one, they may really just not know, and they may not be aware of how this is affecting you, but it becomes strategic for individuals of ethnic backgrounds to want to make sure that we're purchasing things that are promoting us in a positive light and not necessarily continuing and perpetuating the stereotypical views of our community.
Thank you, Aisha. So we have so many questions. We also have very little time.
Yeah.
I think I want to at least address this question that was asked. How should you react to someone that is not open to being educated on, structural racism or the material you cover? How do you deal when people don't want to listen or don't want to be educated?
Y'all want my personal answer or you want my professional answer? Because my professional answer as a clinician would be to understand that, some people have backgrounds and opinions and thoughts that, are specific to them, and we may not be able to change everybody's mind. My personal answer is I don't have the time for people who refuse to be educated on racism. I really don't. Because especially if it's somebody that's close to me, especially if it's somebody I have to interact with all the time, it's not enough for you to not be racist. You must also be anti-racist. You must also be anti the idea that a group of people shouldn't be given equal rights and equal dignity in our country. And if that idea conflicts with who you are as a person, you're not necessarily somebody I need to continue interacting with. And I have made that very evident by the fact that I'm very, very open with continuing to cut people off, because I realize that my stressors that I go through sometimes becomes exasperated by toxic situations and toxic conversations and things that perpetuate me feeling the way I feel and the distress. And so when I've come across individuals in my personal life that are just not open to this, it's not something that I want to further discuss. If I'm not going to change your mind, then you're not somebody that I need to have be a part of my energy and my life anymore, because this is something that's impactful and important to me. And that's hard because sometimes it can be your own family member. It can be somebody within your own family or a friend that you feel obligated because of how many years you've been together. But I can only hope that the individuals who I am close to realize that their thoughts and opinions and behaviors have an impact and are affecting my life in such a way that I don't want them to have harmful ideas imposed upon me. So I think we can do like 2 more questions.
So the next question is, how would you, how should you react to someone? I think you just answered that. How should you react to someone that's not being open to being educated on racism? So you just answered that. The next question is, could you elaborate or develop a sense of understanding, acceptance of racial issue? So the question, I guess, is related to earlier in your presentation on how we should develop a sense of understanding and acceptance of racial issues. I think to answer that really quickly, I think it's just in points of acknowledging that racial inequities exist. And that's how you first get to the place where you can develop. And then I know Aisha is going to send a list of resources that you can read and study that teaches us all how to be anti-racist. And to my white colleagues, I always suggest the book White Fragility is a good book to get started on your anti-racism journey.
Yes. I don't need to answer that. You just did. Let's do two more.
We have one more question as well. Why is it so hard for a lot of whites, or I guess non-Black, to let go of tradition? Could be as simple as change of the name of a product. I know that we have seen that in the news in the last few days, how many companies are changing their image. Why so hard to let go of that tradition? For
I've
some
got
people that are
absolutely
non-Black?
no clue. I really don't even know how to answer this one. I am a very, very proud alumni of the University of Florida. Go Gators all day. If you come to the office, you will be overwhelmed with the orange and blueness of my cubicle. And it was revealed this week that they were going to get away with the Gator bait chants that we used during our football events, and the uproar from my fellow schoolmates on social media has been impressive to see. And so I posted an article about where the offensive nature of the Gator bait chant came from, in that Black infants, not Black people, Black babies and children used to be used as bait to get gators to come closer to the shore so that the hunters could shoot them and then use their skin for products. They would tie ropes around the babies, put them out there, and then as the gators grabbed the bait infants in their mouth and was chomping down, they would then be able to trap those gators and use them for profit and gain. And I've seen people who are just so upset that, well, it's not offensive today because we don't do that anymore. But I can tell you that as a Black individual that went to that college, when every time I heard that chant, it resonated within me that, like, oh my God, this is where this came from. And so even if you may not know, even if this is the first time you're being aware of the history and tradition from which this stemmed, if somebody is telling you, I always go back to, if somebody is telling you that this is harmful and this is offensive and this hurt me, why would you want to continue doing that thing? Why wouldn't we want to make the effort to change for the good nature of our community and our hearts? No. Does that mean that I think that's going to happen all the time? Absolutely not. But I cannot understand why people feel the need that tradition is enough to keep me continuing harmful behaviors. And then I think we have one more and we're over time. So this may be the last answer.
Yeah, and then, so we have one more question, and then I think we're going to have our Chief Executive Officer and President CEO, Kathleen Cannon, say a few words. So the last question we have is, how do I, as a Black woman, navigate a workspace that when we do use our voices, it's perceived as unprofessional or disrespectful, even in instances where we are being truthful?
That's not even coming from the workspaces. That's coming from childhood and just the way that we have been taught to assimilate to the majority population at the denial of our own abilities to be true transparent selves. I have difficulties with that. I have difficulties with that every day. I have friends who object to me saying this, but I have learned really quickly how to code switch. And for those who don't know what code switching is the ability to be different parts of myself in different settings. And sometimes feeling as if I can never truly be all of myself. When I answer the phone, I have a certain professional voice that I answer the phone with. This is Aisha McDonald. How may I help you? This is United Way of Broward County. That is very different from when I'm talking to my Black American friends and I'm like, hey girl, how you doing? What you up to? What's going on? That's very different from how I talk to my Caribbean friends, because I talk like this, I'm just expect that them going to understand, and I don't have a problem with talking like this. And I have learned really quickly that I can't talk in certain voices to certain people because that's not the expectation that they're going to want from me. Or I have learned very quickly how to write emails and review my emails and then leave them for the next morning to re-review my emails and then send it to certain trusted friends to make sure that my voice doesn't come across as angry, because the perception of me speaking out sometimes is that I'm just being another angry Black woman, whereas when I may have a white counterpart or a white male who speaks out, he's being his true assertive self and taking charge. And so, and I have friends who completely disagree with me with code switching, and I completely agree with them. I have a friend who's like, this is me, this is all I'm gonna be, this is who I am all the time, and they go and take it or leave it. But I've learned that it's hard trying to navigate workspaces. It's hard trying to navigate America sometimes, because all of me isn't what they always want to see. So, but thank you guys all for tuning in. I'm gonna turn it over to Kathleen, who is right upstairs me, but social distance, so we haven't seen each other.
Aisha, I cannot wait to come downstairs. I promise I'm going to put my mask on and we will stay 6 feet apart, even though I want to just grab you and hug you. And I am so proud that you are my coworker and that you have delivered this today and that you continue to deliver every day and 24/7 here. You will flip 2020 from being a terrible year to being the year of the pivot that we are finally dismantling systemic racism, handling justice, treating each other with dignity, understanding each other, removing bias, unlearning some behaviors and learning new behaviors. And I just want to be completely open to continuing to listen. And I, again, value you and I thank you. And it has been very difficult to watch how grievance you and other coworkers are here in our community. And I want to promise you that I will work with you and this community to move forward. And I cannot thank you enough. And I just adore you. And for folks tuning in, let's make a shift and a real shift. Let's teach, let's listen, let's learn. Aisha, thank you so much.
And thank you everybody who was able to tune in today. Like I said, if you have any questions, if you need your CEUs, please email me. I will not get to all of them today because there was a lot of you in this. But I'll get to them by next week. I'll try to promise to do that. So thank you so much.
Just one more thing, Aisha will, obviously she said she's gonna send out a list of resources, but you can always go to our website at unitedwaybroward.org and we will continue to have more trainings on this topic. I know Aisha's gonna help lead the way on this, so please be on the lookout for more trainings related to racial equity and as we are all on this journey.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. We're still recording, I believe.
Yes.